Today I want to address a question that's caused a lot of controversy in libertarian circles, as well as political circles generally. Is libertarianism right-wing? Or if not, is it left-wing? Centrist? This is the type of question that when posed can immediately trigger a firestorm. Everyone is convinced that they have the answer, and anyone who disagrees with them is a Nazi or a Maoist or something. Politics is inherently about conflict. Anyone who says that it isn't is selling something. But this is an especially dangerous type of question, because just like social media has been carefully designed to keep you scrolling, concepts like left and right have naturally evolved to keep you arguing. If they couldn't cause controversy, they would lose their power as memes, and people would stop talking about them. So over time, the dichotomy has survived and thrived by becoming associated with all the right things to hit that little lever in your brain which triggers in-group, out-group thinking, while dropping issues that are no longer relevant. That makes rationality really hard. So in order to answer a question like this, we're going to have to take a step back and think about what these labels actually mean. There's no simple answer to that question, but to start, let's look at the origins of the terms themselves. At the start of the French Revolution, the people of France formed a national assembly to represent their interests. The most salient issue of the time was how much people supported the king. Those who supported him a lot sat on the right side of the president of the assembly, and those who were, shall we say, less supportive sat to his left. Now, if you know how the French Revolution went, you'll know that this wouldn't be a relevant issue for very long, because King Louis XVI was executed a few years later. But like I mentioned earlier, these in-group, out-group concepts have a way of evolving around inconvenient details like that. When monarchism lost its place as a major political force, the right side of the National Assembly was occupied by the Girondins, who thought getting rid of the king was all well and good, but things like extreme persecution of religion, changing the calendar to a base 10 system, and otherwise completely restructuring society were not so good. Eventually, this faction was also purged by their left side counterparts, the Montagnards. After France's defeat in the Napoleonic Wars, the monarchists came back to the assembly, and of course sat on the right side. France went back and forth between kingdom, republic, and empire several times over the next century, and with each new iteration of the French state, the assembly was roughly divided between those who supported changing society a lot and those who resisted that change. While the physical seating arrangements didn't last forever, the terms left and right stuck as names for these respective factions. But changing society a lot very quickly as opposed to changing it less or more slowly or even not at all doesn't quite capture the essence of the dichotomy. As a counterexample, even during the most revolutionary days of the Revolution, and actually even today, there are some die-hard French monarchists who support undoing much of the legacy of the French Revolution. That would certainly entail changing society quite a bit, but no one would call them left-wing. The difference is in the framing. These monarchists may want to change society a lot, but they see those changes not as doing something new, but as undoing or counteracting changes that have already been made, restoring something that has been lost or destroyed. I've been using France as an example, but you can see analogous patterns emerge in other countries that use the terms as well. Think about Obama's 2008 campaign. Coming from the modern American left, one of Obama's campaign slogans was simply the word change. Now contrast that with Trump's famous Make America Great Again, and you can see what I'm talking about. Trump is framing himself not as doing something fundamentally new, but as restoring something that's been lost. And that's why, even though many of his policy positions and emphases were quite different than the Republican Party establishment in 2016, he chose to run as a Republican, America's right-wing party. But why is it that across the world we tend to see such similar patterns repeated again and again? What is it that causes people to think one way or the other? The answer is psychology. It's long been known that most people's political views tend to end up similar to those of their parents, particularly as they get older. But is this because their parents are teaching them to follow a certain set of values? Well, partly, but the evidence also tells us that there's a large genetic component. For decades, scientists have conducted studies on the political views of identical twins raised separately in different environments. And very tellingly, they've discovered that the twins tended to agree on politics at much higher rates than random chance would suggest. There are a lot of specific differences between the typical left-wing and right-wing psychological profiles, but some notable ones include conservatives being more sensitive to stimuli designed to trigger the disgust reaction, like vomit and poop. They also tend to be less tolerant of ambiguity and uncertainty than leftists, more likely to interpret facial expressions as threatening, more likely to respond aggressively to confrontation, and less likely to engage in unusual experiences. Essentially, the conservative brain engages with the world in a way one might describe as, well, conservative. Evolutionary psychology is the attempt to explain psychological traits as products of natural selection. And through this lens, it's not hard to imagine the evolutionary strategies of both psychological profiles. The left-wing mind is driven to seek out novel and risky behaviors. For example, in Paleolithic times, someone with a left-wing brain might have taken the risk of eating a strange-looking mushroom, which could either be poisonous or a good source of calories, while a conservative-brained person would be much less likely to do so, because they found it gross. Each behavior has its pros and cons in the risk-reward matrix. In modern times, this translates to support for economic and social experiments, which could create a utopia of abundance, or could lead to tens of millions starving to death in the largest famine in human history, as it did in communist China. But not all political experiments lead to famine and genocide. For its time, the American Revolution was very much a radical political experiment, but it has doubtlessly led to greater freedom and prosperity for Americans. And despite what Rush Limbaugh would tell you, the American Revolution was certainly not a conservative movement. Rather, it was on the whole a classically liberal or libertarian uprising against imperialism. Although, of course, it had a somewhat ideologically eclectic set of leaders, some of whom were much better than others. And the American Revolution is an excellent example of how the concepts of left and right transcend substantive positions on any particular issue. It would be hard to argue that the views of modern American conservatives aren't closer, if only marginally, to those of Americans' founding fathers than American leftists' views are. But this is strictly because the conservative has a reflexive psychological urge to defend the traditions of whatever society he's born into, just as the leftist has a reflexive psychological urge to subvert them. The American founding fathers were probably disproportionately men who had a certain leftist disdain for the world as they found it, which led them to look for edgy ideas. It so happened that the edgy ideas that were available to them at the time were good ones, those of liberalism. And now, centuries after their success, it's the people who seek to uphold tradition who are more supportive of their ideas. Well, at least in theory. One can tell almost the inverse story about the late Soviet Union. By the late 1980s, communism had been the official social doctrine for most of living memory. But as the USSR failed to keep up economically with the US and faced internal tensions over its imperialist occupation of unwilling nations, it began to feel pressure to reform. The subversive ideas which happened to be laying around for leftist-brained people to pick up were liberalism, although by then it had been greatly bastardized. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, he began reforming the USSR along the lines of Western social democracy, thus subverting what were by then the traditions of the USSR. In response, a group of 8 senior communist officials attempted a coup against Gorbachev with the backing of elements of the army. When the coup failed, the Soviet Union was dissolved. 2 years later, the newly independent Russian Federation faced another bout of widespread pro-communist unrest, And in the midst of this crisis, a group of 42 Russian writers, poets, and literary critics published an open letter denouncing the reactionary attempts to restore communism. People who join the military and people who become literary critics have very different psychological profiles. But how these psychological attributes translate into specific political positions can vary widely based on social context. In a society which has promoted communism for basically all of living memory, the psychological conservatives will be communism's most ardent defenders, while the psychological leftists will critique and subvert it. So what does all of this mean for libertarianism's place on the political spectrum? Is libertarianism left, right, or in between? Well, the answer is neither, both, or one or the other depending on the context. In modern America, libertarians have decidedly more in common with conservatives than the ever more totalitarian left. But that's probably not the case in the Middle East, for example, where the left-wing Kurds have been champions of freedom and decentralization against authoritarian religious fundamentalists. Or, to bring this video full circle, when our ideological ancestors Frédéric Bastiat and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon took their seats in the French National Assembly, they were both on the left. Proudhon the anarchist and Bastiat the classical liberal certainly didn't agree on everything, and in fact they had a famously heated debate over interest. But even in this debate, it's clear that they considered themselves to be fundamentally on the same side. To everything there is a season. Thanks for listening. Do you agree with my assessment of the nature of the political spectrum? Whether you do or not, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you're interested in more content like this, remember to subscribe to Springtime of Nations and turn on notifications. I hope you'll tune in next week. Until then, peace to you and yours.